My name is Gloria, and I am 56 years old. I have a tumor on my neck that I have carried for 3 years now. It is not cancerous, but it is visible, a constant reminder of my own mortality. I spent $150,000 on my son's wedding, every penny I had saved for decades. At the wedding dinner in front of 200 guests, my son pointed at me and called me his house cleaner. Then he pointed at his father's girlfriend and introduced her as his real mother. What I did after I left that room silently changed everything. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. If you have ever been ashamed of by someone you sacrificed everything for, this story will speak to your soul. Please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Now let me take you back to the beginning of my heartbreak. I married Robert when I was 23 years old. We were both young and full of dreams. He was charming, ambitious, and told me he wanted to build an empire together. I believed every word. We had our son Daniel 2 years later, and for a brief moment, life felt complete. But Robert's ambition came with a dark side. He was never satisfied. Nothing I did was ever enough. The house was never clean enough. The meals were never fancy enough. I was never pretty enough or sophisticated enough for the image he wanted to project. When Daniel was 7 years old, I found the first lump on my neck. The doctors said it was a benign thyroid nodule, nothing immediately dangerous, but something that needed monitoring. The growth was small, then barely noticeable. But Robert noticed. He started looking at me differently, as if I had become defective somehow. He made comments about how I should wear scarves to hide it. He stopped taking me to his business dinners. He said clients might find it distracting. The marriage deteriorated slowly after that. Robert started coming home later and later. Business trips became more frequent. I pretended not to notice the perfume on his shirts that was not mine. I focused all my energy on Daniel, making sure he had everything he needed, helping him with homework, attending every school event, being both mother and father when Robert was absent. The divorce came when Daniel was 12. Robert had met someone younger, someone without visible imperfections. Her name was Tiffany. She was 28, blonde, and worked as a receptionist at one of Robert's client companies. Robert did not even try to hide the affair by the end. He simply announced one evening that he was leaving and that his lawyer would be in touch. I fought for Daniel in the custody battle. Robert barely contested it. He was too busy starting his new life with Tiffany to be bothered with the daily responsibilities of parenting. I was granted full custody. Robert got visitation rights every other weekend, which he exercised sporadically at best. Daniel would wait by the window on those Saturdays, watching for his father's car. More often than not, the car never came. I raised Daniel alone from that point forward. I worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. During the day, I was an administrative assistant at a law firm. In the evenings and weekends, I cleaned houses for extra income. The irony of that would become painfully clear years later. Every extra dollar I made went into a savings account for Daniel's future. College fund, emergency fund, wedding fund. I wanted him to have opportunities I never had. The tumor on my neck grew slowly over the years. Doctors continued to monitor it, and it remained benign, but it became more visible. By the time Daniel was in high school, it was impossible to hide completely. I noticed how his friends would stare. I noticed how Daniel started walking a few steps ahead of me in public. I told myself it was normal teenage behavior. I told myself he was not ashamed of me. I told myself a lot of things that made the truth easier to ignore. Daniel was smart and driven. He got into a prestigious university on a partial scholarship. I paid for the rest by working extra shifts and dipping into my savings. I attended his graduation with tears streaming down my face, so proud of the man he had become. He hugged me that day and thanked me for everything. I held on to that moment for years, replaying it whenever doubts crept in. After college, Daniel got a job at a financial consulting firm. He climbed the ladder quickly, his father's ambition apparently genetic. He reconnected with Robert during this time. Father and son bonding over business lunches and golf games. I told myself I was happy that Daniel had a relationship with his father. I told myself it did not diminish what we had. I told myself I was not being replaced. Daniel met his fiancée Victoria at a company retreat. She came from old money, the kind of family that had buildings named after them. Her parents owned estates and vacation homes and belonged to country clubs I could never afford to enter. Daniel called me excitedly after their third date, saying he had found the one. I wanted to be happy for him. Part of me was, but another part sensed something shifting, a distance growing that I could not quite name. Victoria and I met for the first time at a restaurant Daniel chose. It was upscale, the kind of place with cloth napkins and prices that made my eyes widen. I wore my best dress and a silk scarf around my neck, positioned carefully to minimize the visibility of my tumor. I had learned over the years how to arrange fabric strategically. Victoria arrived looking like she had stepped out of a magazine. Designer dress, perfect hair, jewelry that probably cost more than my car. She smiled when she saw Daniel, a radiant smile that dimmed noticeably when her eyes landed on me. We shook hands. Hers was limp and brief. She said it was nice to meet me in a tone that suggested the opposite. Dinner was awkward. Victoria directed most of her conversation at Daniel, occasionally acknowledging me with polite but distant responses. When I mentioned my work at the law firm, she nodded without interest. When I asked about her family, she gave vague answers that revealed nothing personal. I felt like I was being interviewed and failing. At one point, my scarf shifted and the tumor became visible. Victoria's eyes darted to it, then quickly away. She did not say anything, but I saw her lean slightly back in her chair, as if whatever I had might be contagious. Daniel noticed too. He reached over and adjusted my scarf for me, his touch gentle, but his expression embarrassed. The evening ended with promises to meet again soon. Those promises were not kept. Over the following months, I saw Daniel less and less. Our weekly dinners became bi-weekly, then monthly, then occasional. He always had excuses. Work was busy. Victoria had plans. Something came up. I accepted each excuse because the alternative was to acknowledge what was really happening. Victoria's family hosted an engagement party at their estate. I received an invitation, formal and impersonal. When I arrived, I felt immediately out of place. The other guests wore gowns and tuxedos. I had on my nicest dress, which suddenly looked cheap and outdated. I kept my scarf wrapped tightly, but I could feel eyes on my neck anyway. Daniel greeted me briefly before being pulled away by Victoria's father for introductions to important people. I stood alone by the buffet table, trying to look like I belonged. Victoria's mother approached me, once asking if I was with the catering company. When I explained I was Daniel's mother, her eyebrows rose in surprise that was not quite concealed. She excused herself quickly. I left the party early, claiming a headache. Daniel walked me to my car. Under the moonlight, he looked tired and torn. He apologized for not spending more time with me. He said things would be different after the wedding. I wanted to believe him. I hugged him and told him I understood. I drove home and cried the entire way. The wedding planning began, and Victoria made clear from the start that she had specific visions. The venue would be a historic mansion with gardens overlooking the river. The guest list would include 300 people. The flowers would be imported from overseas. The dress would be custom-made by a designer whose name I did not recognize, but whose prices I certainly did. The budget was astronomical. Victoria's parents agreed to contribute $100,000. Daniel had savings of about $50,000, but Victoria wanted more. She wanted perfection, and perfection apparently cost more than $300,000. Daniel called me one evening, his voice careful in a way that made me nervous. He explained the situation, the budget gap, the pressure Victoria was under to have a wedding befitting her family's status. He asked if I could help. He said he would understand if I could not. He said he knew I had already done so much. I looked at my savings account, the one I had built over decades of sacrifice. $150,000. It was supposed to be my retirement fund, my safety net, my security for whatever health challenges lay ahead. But this was my son. This was his happiness. I told him yes. I would give him everything. The months before the wedding were a whirlwind of preparations I was largely excluded from. Victoria handled the planning with her mother and a team of professional coordinators. My input was neither requested nor welcomed. When I offered to help address invitations, Victoria said they had already hired a calligrapher. When I suggested a family recipe for the rehearsal dinner, she politely declined, saying the caterer had everything covered. My role, it seemed, was simply to provide funding. The checks I wrote disappeared into the wedding machine without acknowledgement. $150,000 over 6 months. Each time I signed my name, I felt a piece of my security evaporating. But I reminded myself of the goal. Daniel's happiness, a perfect wedding, a future worth celebrating. 2 months before the wedding, I had a routine checkup with my endocrinologist. The news was not what I expected. The tumor had grown significantly. It was still benign, but its size was now causing complications. The doctor recommended surgery to remove it. The procedure was straightforward, but recovery would take several weeks. He suggested scheduling it after any major events I had planned. I told him about Daniel's wedding. He nodded and said we could wait until after, but he advised against delaying too long. I scheduled the surgery for 2 weeks after the wedding date. I did not tell Daniel. He had enough on his mind. I did not want to add worry about my health to his pre-wedding stress. The tumor grew more prominent as the weeks passed. My scarves could no longer fully conceal it. I noticed Daniel's eyes flickering to my neck during our rare visits. I noticed him steering me away from group photos when Victoria's family was around. I noticed him suggesting I might be more comfortable sitting rather than standing during the reception. One evening, about a month before the wedding, Daniel came to my house alone. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had helped him with homework for years, and struggled to find words. Finally, he asked me something that shattered my heart into pieces. He asked if I would consider not sitting at the head table during the reception. He said Victoria's family had concerns about appearances. He said it might be better if I sat with other guests instead. He said it was not his idea, but he needed to keep the peace. I stared at my son, this man I had sacrificed everything for, and tried to understand what he was really asking. He was asking me to hide. He was asking me to diminish myself so that his new family would not be embarrassed. He was asking me to accept that my visible flaw made me unsuitable for a place of honor at my own son's wedding. I told him I understood. I told him I would do whatever made things easier for him. I watched relief flood his face, and something inside me cracked. He hugged me before he left and said he loved me. The words felt hollow in a way they never had before. The week before the wedding, I attended the rehearsal dinner at a private club Victoria's parents belonged to. I wore a new dress I could not really afford and a strategically draped scarf that I hoped would minimize attention to my neck. I arrived early, wanting to find my seat before too many eyes were watching. Robert was there with Tiffany. They had been together for nearly 2 decades now, though they had never married. Tiffany had aged well, still blonde, still polished, still everything I was not. She greeted me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Robert nodded in my direction and then turned his attention elsewhere. We had not had a real conversation in years. The dinner proceeded with toasts and laughter and stories about Daniel and Victoria's future together. Victoria's father spoke about legacy and tradition. Victoria's mother spoke about gaining a wonderful son. Robert spoke about being proud of Daniel's achievements. No one asked me to speak. My invitation to this inner circle apparently did not extend to having a voice. During the meal, I overheard a conversation at the next table. 2 of Victoria's aunts were discussing the wedding arrangements. One of them mentioned the seating chart and how complicated it had been to arrange. The other laughed and said at least the problematic elements had been handled discreetly. I did not need to ask what problematic elements meant. After dinner, I found Daniel alone for a moment by the dessert table. I touched his arm and told him how proud I was of him. He smiled, but his eyes kept darting around the room, checking to see who was watching us. He thanked me quickly and excused himself to rejoin Victoria. I drove home that night with a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with my physical health. I sat in my empty house surrounded by photos of Daniel at every age and wondered where I had lost him. Had it been gradual, happening so slowly I did not notice, or had it been sudden the moment Victoria entered his life and found me inadequate? The surgery was scheduled for 11 days after tonight. I would have my tumor removed, and perhaps without it, Daniel would not be ashamed to stand next to me. Perhaps without this visible imperfection, I would be acceptable to his new family. I hated that I was thinking this way. I hated that I was considering changing my body to earn my son's love, but the thought persisted anyway. The day of the wedding arrived, with perfect weather. Sunshine streamed through my bedroom window as I prepared myself. I chose a dress that was elegant, but not attention-seeking. Neutral colors, nothing that would draw eyes. I spent 30 minutes arranging my scarf, trying different configurations, until I found one that minimized the tumor's visibility as much as possible. I arrived at the venue early. The historic mansion was even more beautiful than the photos had suggested. Gardens bloomed with imported flowers. White chairs lined the lawn, facing an altar covered in roses. Everything was exactly as Victoria had planned. Everything my money had helped pay for. The ceremony was beautiful. Daniel stood at the altar, looking handsome and nervous in his tailored tuxedo. Victoria floated down the aisle in her custom gown, a vision in white that cost more than most people's cars. They exchanged vows that sounded rehearsed but sincere. They kissed as husband and wife, while 200 guests applauded. I sat in the third row, not the front where a mother typically sits. Victoria's parents occupied the first row on her side. Robert and Tiffany sat in the first row on Daniel's side. I was positioned behind them, visible but not prominent. I told myself it did not matter where I sat. What mattered was being here witnessing my son's happiness. After the ceremony, guests mingled during the cocktail hour, while the wedding party took photographs. I was not included in the photo session. When I approached the photographer to ask about family pictures, Daniel appeared at my side and gently guided me away. He said they were running behind schedule and would do family photos later. Later never came. The reception was held in the mansion's grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables decorated with elaborate centerpieces. A live orchestra played softly as guests found their seats. I located my table near the back of the room, sharing space with distant relatives and business acquaintances who did not quite fit elsewhere. The dinner began with the wedding party's entrance. Daniel and Victoria swept into the room to thunderous applause. They took their seats at the head table, surrounded by bridesmaids and groomsmen and parents. Victoria's parents sat to her right. Robert and Tiffany sat to Daniel's left. The chair that should have been mine was occupied by someone else entirely. I watched from my distant table as toasts were made. Victoria's father spoke eloquently about his daughter and her bright future. Victoria's mother spoke about the joy of welcoming Daniel into their family. Robert stood and spoke about his pride in Daniel's accomplishments, his voice carrying across the room with practiced confidence. Then came the moment that would change everything. The master of ceremonies announced that Daniel wanted to say a few words. My son stood champagne glass in hand and looked out at the assembled guests. He thanked everyone for coming. He thanked Victoria's parents for their generosity. He thanked Robert for his guidance over the years. Then he began introducing the important people in his life. He gestured to Victoria's parents and praised their warmth and acceptance. He gestured to Robert and called him his inspiration. Then he turned toward Tiffany, his father's girlfriend, the woman who had helped break apart our family, and said words that stopped my heart. He said that Tiffany had been like a real mother to him over the years. He said she had shown him what grace and elegance looked like. He said he was grateful to have her in his life. 200 guests applauded. Then Daniel's eyes found me at my distant table. He paused, and for one moment I thought he was going to acknowledge the truth. I thought he was going to tell these people that the woman sitting in the back, the one with the scarf around her neck, was his actual mother, the one who had raised him alone, the one who had paid for this entire celebration. Instead, he smiled and said he also wanted to thank the household staff who had helped over the years, gesturing vaguely in my direction. He said a special thanks to Gloria, who had kept things running smoothly at home. He called me his house cleaner, in front of 200 people, while Tiffany basked in the title of real mother. The applause continued. Guests nodded politely in my direction, acknowledging the help. Victoria smiled, satisfied. Robert looked uncomfortable for a brief moment, then joined the applause. Tiffany actually waved at me, a gracious wave from the woman who had been given my role. I sat frozen in my chair. The room spun around me. I could feel eyes on me, people wondering why the house cleaner was sitting at a guest table instead of with the catering staff. I could feel my face burning with humiliation that went deeper than any physical pain I had ever experienced. I stood up slowly. My legs felt unsteady, but I made them move. I picked up my purse and walked toward the exit. I did not run. I did not cry. I simply walked with as much dignity as I could gather past tables of strangers, past the head table where my son sat with his new family, past the doors, and out into the cool evening air. No one stopped me. No one called my name. No one seemed to notice or care that the house cleaner was leaving early. I walked to my car, got inside, and sat in the darkness for a long time before I could bring myself to start the engine. The drive home was a blur. I do not remember traffic lights or turns or any of the normal details of a familiar route. I remember only the words echoing in my head. House cleaner, real mother, the casual cruelty of it, the public erasure of everything I had been and done. I arrived home and sat in my driveway for another hour. The house was dark. The neighborhood was quiet. Inside were all the photographs of Daniel's childhood. First steps, first words, first day of school. Every milestone documented by a mother who loved him completely. A mother who had apparently been demoted to household staff. I finally went inside and turned on the lights. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. I walked through the rooms like a stranger, seeing my life through new eyes. The sacrifices I had made, the dreams I had deferred, the security I had surrendered, all for a son who was ashamed to acknowledge me in front of his new family. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that grew cold in my hands and thought about what to do next. Part of me wanted to call Daniel and demand an explanation. Part of me wanted to rage and scream and make him understand how deeply he had wounded me. Part of me wanted to pretend nothing had happened and go back to accepting whatever crumbs of acknowledgement he was willing to offer. But a quieter part of me, a part that had been silenced for too long, had a different idea. That part reminded me of my own worth. That part reminded me that I had survived losing a husband, raising a child alone, building a career, and facing health challenges without breaking. That part asked why I was still accepting treatment that I would never tolerate from anyone else. By morning, I had made a decision. I would not rage. I would not beg. I would not pretend. I would simply act. The first call I made was to my financial advisor. I explained that I needed to understand exactly what I had contributed to my son's wedding and whether any of it could be recovered. The advisor pulled the records. $150,000. Most of it had already been spent, but some deposits and payments had been made in my name and could potentially be redirected or cancelled. I gave the instructions. Cancel what could be cancelled. Redirect what could be redirected. Recover what could be recovered. I did not want revenge. I wanted to stop giving to someone who saw me as nothing more than a source of funds. The honeymoon trip to Europe that I had paid for as a wedding gift was still refundable. I cancelled it. The deposit I had placed on the couple's future home, a generous gift that Daniel did not even know about yet, was recovered. The trust fund I had been planning to establish for their future children was halted before the paperwork was finalized. In total, I recovered about $40,000. It was not everything, but it was something. It was a statement. It was a boundary. The second thing I did was write a letter. Not an angry letter, not a bitter letter, a truthful letter. I wrote about my life, about raising Daniel alone after Robert left, about the years of sacrifice and the jobs I worked and the dreams I deferred. I wrote about the tumor on my neck and how it had made me feel like a burden to be hidden rather than a mother to be honored. I wrote about the wedding, about sitting in the back, about being excluded from photographs, about the moment when my son called me a house cleaner and named another woman as his real mother. I wrote about how those words had felt, how they had broken something that might never fully heal. I ended the letter with something that surprised even me as I wrote it. I told Daniel that I loved him. I told him I would always love him, because that is what mothers do. But I also told him that love does not require me to accept humiliation. I told him that my worth as a person and as his mother did not depend on his acknowledgement of it. I told him that I was removing myself from a relationship where I was not valued, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. I mailed the letter the next morning. Then I scheduled my surgery. The weeks following the wedding were a strange mixture of grief and liberation. I grieved the relationship I had thought I had with my son. I grieved the future I had imagined being a grandmother, watching Daniel build his life, being part of a family that loved and respected me. That future was gone now, replaced by uncertainty. But alongside the grief was something unexpected: freedom. For the first time in decades, I was not arranging my life around someone else's needs. I was not saving money for someone else's dreams. I was not hiding parts of myself to make others comfortable. I was simply existing as myself, Tumor, and all without apology. The surgery went well. The tumor was removed completely, and the biopsy confirmed it remained benign. Recovery took several weeks, during which I had time to think and rest and heal in more ways than one. Friends I had neglected during the wedding chaos came to visit, bringing meals and flowers and company. I realized I had allowed my world to shrink to only Daniel, and that shrinking had been unhealthy. Daniel called 3 days after receiving my letter. I did not answer. He left a voicemail, his voice confused and defensive. He said I had misunderstood. He said he did not mean anything by what he said at the wedding. He said I was overreacting. He said we needed to talk. I did not call back. He called again and again over the following weeks. The messages evolved. Confusion gave way to anger. Anger gave way to pleading. Pleading gave way to accusations. He said I was being childish. He said I was punishing him unfairly. He said Victoria was upset about the honeymoon being cancelled. He said I was ruining his marriage before it even started. I did not respond to any of it. Victoria called once. Her message was cold and clipped. She said my behavior was inappropriate and that I was causing unnecessary stress during what should be a happy time. She said if I had concerns, I should have addressed them privately instead of making dramatic gestures. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge what Daniel had said about me. She simply demanded that I fall back in line. I deleted the message without response. Robert reached out through email, the first direct communication we had in years. His message was surprisingly gentle. He said he had not known about what Daniel said until afterward. He said he had spoken to Daniel about it. He said he understood if I needed space, but he hoped we could all find a way forward eventually. I read his email, but did not reply. Whatever Robert had to say now came decades too late to matter. The person whose communication meant the most came unexpectedly. Patricia, Victoria's mother, sent a handwritten note. She said she had been appalled by what happened at the reception. She said she had not known about the seating arrangements or the introduction debacle until it was too late. She said Victoria had assured her that everything was fine between Daniel and his mother. She apologized for her family's part in the hurt I had experienced. I wrote back to Patricia. I thanked her for her honesty. I told her the situation was between me and Daniel and that I did not hold her responsible. We exchanged a few more notes over the following months and developed an unexpected rapport. She became one of the few connections to that world I maintained. 6 months after the wedding, Daniel appeared at my door. I had not seen him since that night in the ballroom. He looked thinner, tired, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He asked if we could talk. For reasons I still do not fully understand, I let him in. We sat in my living room, the same room where he had played as a child, where I had read him stories and dried his tears and celebrated his successes. He looked around, as if seeing it for the first time, as if noticing the history contained in these walls. He said Victoria had left him. 3 months into the marriage, she had announced that things were not working out. She had expected a certain lifestyle that Daniel's salary alone could not provide, especially after I had withdrawn my financial support. Without the trust fund and the house deposit and the ongoing help she had assumed would continue, the future looked different than she had imagined. She filed for annulment. I listened without interrupting. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt sad for my son, whose choice of partner had proven so shallow. Part of me wondered if this was why he had come, hoping that his failed marriage would soften me enough to resume my previous role. Daniel started to cry. Not the tears of a man whose marriage had failed, but deeper tears, the kind that came from somewhere long buried. He said he was sorry. He said he had not understood what he was doing until it was too late. He said Victoria had made him feel ashamed of his background, ashamed of me, and he had gone along with it because he wanted to belong to her world. He said the moment he called me his house cleaner, he had felt something break inside him. He had seen my face, seen me stand and walk away, and known immediately that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But he had been too much of a coward to stop the wedding, to correct the record, to run after me and apologize. He said he had read my letter 100 times. Each time he understood more clearly what he had done. Each time the weight of it grew heavier. He said he did not expect me to forgive him. He said he did not deserve forgiveness. He just needed me to know that he saw now what he had been too blind to see before. I let the silence stretch between us. His tears subsided. He wiped his face with his hands, a gesture so familiar from childhood that my heart ached despite everything. I told him I appreciated his apology. I told him I believed it was sincere. I told him that forgiveness was not something I could offer in a single conversation, but that healing was possible over time. I told him I loved him because I did, because nothing he had done could erase that fundamental truth. But I also told him things would be different now. I told him I would not be his safety net or his backup plan. I told him our relationship would need to be rebuilt slowly on foundations of mutual respect that had never existed before. I told him he would need to prove through actions, not words, that he valued me as his mother and not just as a source of support. He nodded, accepting the terms. He did not argue or defend or explain. He simply accepted. Before he left, he asked about my surgery. I touched my neck, where a thin scar now replaced the tumor that had marked me for so long. I told him the surgery had gone well, that I was healthy, that the future looked better than it had in years. He asked if he could hug me. I said yes. The hug lasted a long time. When he pulled away, his eyes were wet again. He said he would call soon, and this time it sounded like a promise rather than an empty phrase. He walked to his car, and I watched from the doorway until he drove away. 2 years have passed since that wedding dinner. My life looks nothing like I imagined it would, and somehow that has become a blessing rather than a loss. I retired from my jobs and used the money I had recovered to start a small business, a consulting service helping other women navigate major life transitions, divorce, empty nests, health challenges, career changes. The things I had survived made me qualified to help others survive them too. The business grew slowly but steadily, bringing purpose and connection I had not known I was missing. My health remains good. The surgery was successful, and follow-up appointments have shown no recurrence. The scar on my neck has faded to a thin line that I no longer bother to hide. I stopped wearing scarves entirely. The tumor had never been the real problem anyway. The real problem had been believing that my worth depended on how others perceived my appearance. Daniel and I rebuilt our relationship, though it took longer than either of us expected. He started therapy to understand the patterns that had led him to value status over substance. He got a new job that paid less, but fulfilled him more. He started calling me weekly, then twice weekly, genuine conversations about real things rather than surface pleasantries. He introduced me to his new girlfriend, a kindergarten teacher named Emily, who wore second-hand clothes and laughed easily and looked at Daniel with uncomplicated affection. The first time they came to dinner, Emily asked to see my baby photos of Daniel. She spent an hour poring over albums, exclaiming over chubby cheeks and missing teeth and terrible haircuts. She treated me like a mother worth knowing, not a burden to be managed. Last Thanksgiving, Daniel cooked dinner at my house. He had learned to cook during his time alone, he said, because eating takeout every night was expensive and lonely. He made a turkey that was slightly overcooked and stuffing that was too salty, and a pie that he admitted came from the grocery store because baking was still beyond his skills. It was the best Thanksgiving meal I had ever had. After dinner, we sat on my porch watching the sunset. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, inside food coma, she called it, with a drowsy smile before dozing off. Daniel and I were alone in the fading light. He told me he thought about that wedding often, not with longing for what he had lost with Victoria, but with shame for what he had done to me. He said he would spend the rest of his life making up for it, even though he knew some debts could never be fully repaid. I told him something I had been thinking about for a long time. I told him that what happened at that wedding was the worst moment of my life, but it was also a turning point. It forced me to see clearly what I had been ignoring for years. It forced me to value myself in ways I had forgotten how to do. It forced both of us to become better people than we had been before. The pain did not disappear. It became something else. A scar like the one on my neck. A reminder of what I had survived. A mark of battles fought and won. If you are watching this and someone you love has made you feel ashamed of who you are, I want you to know something. Their shame is not your truth. Their inability to see your worth does not diminish it. You are allowed to walk away from tables where you are not valued, even if you paid for every chair. You are allowed to write letters that tell the truth. You are allowed to cancel honeymoons and redirect funds and refuse to continue giving to those who only take. You are allowed to heal and rebuild and create a life that honors who you really are. Thank you for listening to my story today. If it resonated with you, I would love to hear from you. Has anyone ever made you feel ashamed of something about yourself that you could not change? How did you find the strength to reclaim your worth? Please leave a comment below, sharing your experience. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. Your likes help this video reach others who might need to hear these words today. Please subscribe to this channel so you do not miss future stories of resilience and hope. And if you know someone who is struggling with feeling unvalued by people who should love them most, please share this video with them. May you always know your own worth, especially when others fail to see it. May you find the courage to walk away from places where you are diminished, and may you discover that the most important voice in your life is your own. Until next time, take care of yourselves. You deserve it.